begin with a story by Karen Maines. Envision the scene. It's a wedding. The groom stands at the front. He's in his spotless attire. His tuxedo is freshly starched and pressed. He's handsome. He's full of anticipation. His shoes are shined and every hair is in place. And he's anxiously awaiting the picture of loveliness of his bride that he's been dreaming of, this beautiful bride. Now the magical moment arrives. The pipe organ reaches a full crescendo and the doors swing open. The people stand to get a first glimpse of the lovely bride in white with her lace veil, but they gasp because limping down the aisle is the bride whose dress is dirty and torn. Her arms are scratched and bruised and bleeding. Her dress is soiled and torn. Her leg seems twisted. She's got cuts and bruises all over her bare arms. Her nose is bleeding and her hair is disheveled. Doesn't this handsome groom deserve a better bride than this? But alas, no. The church, the bride of Christ, has been fighting again. Karen Maines calls this story the brawling bride. And sadly, I've experienced some of this. I've experienced the church fighting several times. Early in our church experience, the first church where my husband and I worshiped ended up in a contentious, ugly church split. And some of my closest friends not only left the church, but they left the Lord. They said, if this is the way people of God act, we don't want any part of it. And sadly, the new pastor that was then brought on after several years was let go because of some immoral behavior on his part. I've had my taste of conflict as well, two big ones over almost 35 plus years of ministry. The first one almost took me out, but a good friend of mine, Kelly Matthews, and I ended up writing a book, Leading Women Who Wound, about women and conflict. The second one, I was better prepared and it wasn't so difficult. But I have learned that we are all called to be relational peacemakers. If we're going to honor and love each other well, we need to learn peacemaking skills. Conflict is nothing new. We see it rearing its head even in Philippi, which was by and large a peace-loving, solid, mature church. If it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. And Paul is going to, in our lesson this time, give us some wonderful advice about peacemaking, about becoming a people who are skilled at conflict resolution. Well, what happened in Philippi? Obviously, they're in a conflict. They're experiencing a conflict. Now, often when you have a lot of different kinds of people in a spiritual community, you have a greater opportunity for conflict because they may have different preferences. And we know that there are a lot of different kinds of people there. If we look back to our first lesson where we saw the founding of the church, we see that it's very likely that a number of those people are still there. We have Lydia, this influential widow. Probably the church met, we know it met in her home initially. It may still be meeting there. We have the jailer who changed from a tough guy who intimidated prisoners to a man who loved Jesus. We have a possessed slave girl who was finally freed from her demons. And probably a motley crew of criminals. We know they were in the prison that night. We know they didn't run when the prison doors flew open because of an earthquake to free Paul and Silas, but they're still there. I think it's because they are there because they want to know what in the world is going on. We have all these different people. We have someone named Clement. We don't know much about him. We have Epaphroditus. We do know he was a great servant of the Lord. But we have these different people, and yet even still, those people seem to be getting along very well. It's a wonderful model for us. We do have two women Euodia and Syntyche, who were likely leaders in the church who are in a dispute. Paul calls them co-workers who have contended by his side in the cause of the gospel. But for some unknown reason, they are disagreeing. And the contentious nature of their relationship now is serious enough that Paul has heard about it. And he is pleading with them to work this out. He's concerned enough that he also calls on the male Philippian leaders to help these women reconcile. Now, obviously, the issue is not false doctrine. If it was, he would have come down heavily, but he doesn't. Just tells them to make peace for the sake of unity. Now, we learn about this conflict in chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. And then there are verses that follow, 4 through 9, which are some of the best known verses in all of the Bible. But they are seldom interpreted in the context of conflict. And I think these are marvelous lessons. If we apply 4 through 9 to conflict, we're really we're in the structure, we're in the context of the passage. We have marvelous lessons about conflict if we apply 4 through 9 to these kinds of situations. I wonder if 4 through 9 were not originally meant as sound counsel for people embroiled in conflict. These well-known passages can certainly be applied to other situations as well. Paul's counsel, he talks about gentleness. Certainly gentleness is needed in a conflict. He talks about prayer, and that's great advice for people who are in a disagreement. In verse 8, he admonishes us to focus on the positive, the praiseworthy, to see the best. And that's certainly sound advice when we are in a conflict as well. And he ends the section with the result clause, where he says, "And the God of peace will be with you." He's giving us helpful advice as we struggle to seek peace. And this section is full of insight. Now, Paul wasn't the only one to highlight the importance of peace and unity. I'm always convicted by the serious nature of disunity when I consider Jesus' final prayer in John 17. On the night before he went to the cross, he spoke about the high value of unity in the Christian life. He's praying for all of us. And he says this, he says, "I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message." He has prayed for the disciples. He's leaving them soon. But he's praying for all who will be influenced by their message. That's all of us. And he says that all of them may be one. "Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us." Why? "So that the world may believe that you have sent me." We who follow Christ are called to be peacemakers. It's a skill, but it's not optional. Jesus commands us because the enemy uses divisions to dishonor God, to wreak havoc in our communities, and to muddy the name of Jesus Christ. My hope and my prayer is that this passage will challenge you to make relational peacemaking and peacekeeping a goal in your life. That you will become a person of peace, not a person who is divisive. And as a result, you will experience joy, because disunity, conflict is a nasty joy killer. I'm still learning, but I've come a long way, and so can you.